Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. I'm Frater Entelecheia. This is a talk that I gave recently at Horizon Lodge in Seattle called Tarot and the Path of Initiation. Most people who are familiar with the Tarot are familiar with it as a divinatory tool. To use Tarot for divination, you approach it with a certain question or problem in mind, shuffle the deck, you lay the cards out in a spread similar to what you see here. And wherever the cards occur in the spread, it indicates some kind of answer to the problem or some kind of path forward. But the use of the Tarot from an esoteric point of view is different from its use as a tool of divination. When we're considering Tarot from an esoteric point of view, we're concerned with it more as a pictorial representation of two complementary processes. The first process is the process of creation. Here we're looking at the underlying structure of reality, or what we might consider to be the magical universe. From the complementary perspective, the perspective of initiation, we are looking at the Tarot as a pictorial representation of the path back to that source from which creation springs. When we're looking at Tarot from an esoteric point of view, we're going to focus more on the Major Arcana cards. In this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about the court cards and a little bit about the numbered cards, but our main emphasis is going to be on the Major Arcana. One of the first things to consider when looking at the Major Arcana is that at the top of each card we see a number. So the cards run from 0, the Fool, up to the Universe, which has the Roman numeral 21. And all the cards in between have different numbers at the top of them. We can use the numbers as a point of orientation if we're thinking about these two processes. So as the numbers are going up from 0 to 21, we're looking at the unfolding of creation. When we look at the numbers going backward from 21 down to 0, we're looking at the path of initiation. We're looking at the path of return to the source. Now, at the outset, I should point out that when I say initiation, I do not primarily mean temple initiation. So, for example, you might receive initiation into an order like OTO or the Golden Dawn or AA, where they utilize temple initiations. A temple initiation is merely a dramatic representation of the actual process of initiation. The actual process of initiation is something that only you can do for yourself, really, by elevating your consciousness, by working on your consciousness and working through your own experience. Initiation is inherently an individual process. Of course, it can be aided in various ways by teachers and even by temple initiations. And, some people even think that a temple initiation can do something magically for a candidate to perhaps make it more likely that they will attain. And I don't see anything wrong with that perspective, but the process that I'm going to be talking about today is really a personal inward process. It's something that really only the person going through it can judge. And we're going to be looking at these Major Arcana cards as symbolic representations of what happens along that purely personal, purely individualistic path. But before we do so, we should think a little bit about what counts as creation in Thelema. Thelema is based on Kabbalah, which is a form of Jewish mysticism. The 20th century Kabbalistic scholar Gershom Scholem has said, quote, "The essence of the Kabbalistic idea of God lies in its resolutely dynamic conception of the Godhead." So, often from a modern perspective, when we think of God, we tend to think in more abstract terms. We might hold a deistic view of God as sort of the original designer of the universe, who had the thought of the universe and who created it and who set it in motion, and then who, basically took his hands off of it and doesn't interfere in its operation, except maybe once in a while to, help the Israelites commit genocide, or to, maybe miraculously cure someone of cancer because everyone's praying for them. But for the most part, we tend to think, of those notions as being kind of, pre-modern or unsophisticated. We don't really like the idea of, many people find the idea of the Old Testament God somewhat abhorrent because of his, mercurial disposition and wrathful and jealous tendencies and so forth. But the notion of God in Kabbalah is actually much closer to that traditional Old Testament idea of God than it is to the modern God. In Kabbalah, you see represented a God that is both merciful and wrathful. You see this on the Tree of Life with the two pillars. You see a God that is both male and female, and sometimes neither, and sometimes both. We see a God who is in the process of becoming. This is a really important part of Kabbalah, which is that dynamic conception, the idea of God undergoing change, the idea of God undergoing a kind of life story or a process of learning. This is intrinsic to the notion of Kabbalah, and it's intrinsic to the notion of deity and of creation in Thelema. One of the interesting ambiguities of the deity in Kabbalah is that the Kabbalistic God is both transcendent and immanent. So by transcendent, I mean completely independent of the universe, completely independent of manifestation, even of thought, maybe even of possibility. And then by immanent, I mean present, accessible, part of this world, embodied even, here and now. In Kabbalah, the absolutely transcendent aspect of God is called Ein Sof, which means there is no end or infinity. And in traditional Kabbalah, Ein Sof is often equated with just Ein, which means nothing. This is what Crowley refers to as the Kabbalistic zero. If you read his essay, Bereshith, he discusses how he thinks existence comes out of nothing, but that this nothingness is the ultimate context in which all things find manifestation or expression. And this is, in fact, a traditional Kabbalistic idea. This is not something that Crowley simply, inserted into Kabbalah. It actually represents, I think, an insight into Kabbalistic theory. So in Kabbalah, you find this identity between Ein Sof, which we might think of infinity or the absolute all, and Ein, which you might think of absolute nothing. So being and nothing are equated in Kabbalah, at least in this completely, utterly transcendent, utterly mysterious aspect of God. Because the intellect has a really hard time getting into the idea that, being and nothing are the same thing. We tend to think of them as separate from one another. This transcendent aspect of God, Ein Sof, is also neither subject nor object. So in order to have subject and object, you need to have some kind of differentiation. But the point of Ein Sof, or Ein, is that there is no differentiation. There's uniformity. And so if there's complete uniformity, there is no external relation. This God does not relate to anything outside of itself. It also doesn't relate to anything inside of itself, which means that it doesn't really have a sense of self at all. But according to Kabbalistic theory, while God is neither subject nor object, there is something like a primordial will within God to know itself. God wills to see and to know God as God. And this is expressed in the change of Ein, or nothing, to Ani. Nothing changes into I. So you can see that there is a play on the word here, Ein, where the N is moved to the end, and, or rather, the I is moved to the end to form the word I. So within this primordial conception of God, this uniform conception of God, there's something like this underlying urge, barely expressed, for God to know God, to have perfect self-knowledge and perfect self-relation. And I emphasize the word perfect here because there are varying degrees of self-awareness. We can know this even with really sort of simple, close-to-home examples. So, for example, a crab has eyes that are on stalks, and those stalks could be arranged such that the crab is able to see its own body. But just because a crab can see its own body doesn't mean that it knows that that is its body. It doesn't know that it is a thing in the world, along with other things. It doesn't know itself as subject. Likewise, your Uncle Pete can walk into a room, wearing a clown costume, and you don't recognize that person as Uncle Pete, even though you are looking right at Uncle Pete. We've all had experiences where, with ourselves or with someone else, where we might say, oh, that person just doesn't really know themselves or doesn't really recognize themselves. You have instances of things like projection, where we're critical of some character trait in another person, not recognizing that we have that character trait in ourselves, and we're uncomfortable with it. So there are varying degrees of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is, in other words, is not just a perception. It's not just being. It's not just perception, but it is being and perception with a certain correct conceptual framework, which means that it's complex. There are varying layers that have to be built up to get to self-consciousness. And the exact same thing applies to God in this system. God has to go through a process of building up his or her or its own self-conception, and it goes through stages. The final stage of this process, the eye of God, the Kabbalists associated with Malkuth, or the kingdom. So here you see Malkuth on the diagram, which is called the Tree of Life. Malkuth is the 10th or final Sephira on this tree of interconnected circles, which we know as the Tree of Life. These circles are called the Sephiroth. This is a term which first occurs in the Sefer Yetzirah. It just means numbers. This diagram you should understand as something of a contrivance. So you see a hierarchical relationship here between these various circles, and it's important not to take this too literally. In some of the Kabbalistic theories, each Sephira is thought of as being equally close to its source. So we tend to think of the source as all the way up at the top here, and then we think of Malkuth as sort of the material universe that we inhabit, and we think, well, gosh, we're so far from God. And That's not really the that's not really the Kabbalistic conception. Although it's easy to fall into that belief when you look at, a diagram like this, because Malkuth is all the way at the bottom. And people sometimes talk about, oh, well, those are just Malkuthian issues, and, to sort of differentiate them from spiritual things. And that's valid. It's important not to get too carried away with the metaphor, though, because, in fact, from the Kabbalistic point of view, the self-consciousness of God, the completion of God, is really all the way down there at the bottom. While Ein, or Ein Sof, is the most transcendent aspect of God, the most mysterious and withdrawn aspect of God, it's not as though, and of course that does imply a certain amount of privilege. It's not as though that is somehow more God than Malkuth, because Malkuth is actually the fully formed, fully self-conscious aspect of God. And we tend to think of the final version of something as being the most complete version of it, the fullest version of it. So it's important not to get too carried away. You'll notice up at the top I have Ein equals Ein Sof, absolute nothing equals absolute all. You will sometimes see versions of this diagram, especially in the magical tradition, that has Ein, Ein Sof, and Ein Sof Or at the top. Ein Sof Or is unlimited light, and this will sometimes be called the three veils of non-existence, or the three negative veils. Ein Sof Or is not part of traditional Kabbalah. If you want to get into certain very deep aspects of esoteric Thelema, then you do need Ein Sof Or in order to understand them. But in terms of what we're talking about today, it's actually not necessary. It's just another layer of complexity that's not really going to add anything to the story. So I'm leaving it out. I'm sticking with the traditional Kabbalistic schema. You'll notice that there's a dotted line up there going through that top sphere, which we're going to talk about in a moment. That's because there is an ambiguous relationship between Ein Sof, and that top sphere, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So the dotted line represents sort of that ambiguous relationship. So according to the theory, God comes into manifestation by means of what's called the lightning flash, which you see illustrated here with the yellow arrows going down through each of the spheres. So the idea is that there's this primordial urge, this primordial will, and this urge is realized by this lightning flash, by this expansion or activation of each of these Sephiroth. And the current, so to speak, makes it all the way to the bottom, and as it goes down, it is activating, so to speak, each one of these spheres. Here you can see the names and numbers associated with each of the spheres. At the top we have Kether, which means crown in English. It is thought of as a kind of blank oneness, or as the one. So as I mentioned, I have the dotted line here because there's in fact very little to distinguish between Kether and Ein Sof. Kether is blank oneness, it's uniform oneness, which is also the same thing as nothingness. So that's really the same idea that was captured in Ein, or Ein Sof. So you can really think of Kether as being part of that original essence of the divinity, or the purely transcendent aspect of it. The current then goes down to the second sphere, called Chokmah, which means wisdom. You can think of Chokmah as the thought of creation itself. So we're not dealing with creation yet. We're not dealing with anything created. We're not even really dealing at this point with particular thoughts. This is a little hard to kind of get your mind around, but this is something more like thinking as such. Thinking without any differentiation or any content. And indeed, if you read the Vision and the Voice, where Crowley is talking about chaos, which he associates with this sphere of Chokmah, you can pick up on some of that original Kabbalistic idea there. The current then goes across and touches the third sphere, which is called Binah, or understanding. It's also thought of as the womb. This is considered to be a feminine sphere, in contrast with Hokmah, which is thought to be more masculine. You can think of this as the specification or the particularization of the thoughts that were implied in Hokmah. So if you imagine that thinking or thought is a kind of substance, that substance is getting broken up in Binah into particular thoughts. And so what we're dealing with here for the first time is something like a concept of limitation. Because in order to differentiate one thing from another, you need to have borders between things. So you need to have limitation, you need to have finitude. And in Thelema, Crowley associates Binah with something like a full spiritual understanding of suffering. And that actually makes a great deal of sense, because we tend to think of finitude and suffering as being closely linked. If something has a beginning, a middle, and an end, or it can be broken off from other things, then we tend to think of that as the origin of suffering. Together, these three Sephiroth, Kether, Hokmah, and Binah, form what is called the supernal triad. The Christian Kabbalists were eager to sort of shoehorn this into the Christian Trinity. It's probably better to think about it in Neoplatonic terms. So you can think of Kether as the one, you can think of Hokmah as nous or mind, and you can think of Binah as something like the world soul. The 7 remaining Sephiroth were associated with the 7 days of creation. So the current passes down to Chesed, the 4th Sephiro, which is also called mercy. This is the expansive quality of God. This is the part of God that spreads out to fill up all of creation with its thoughts. It's connecting with space, it's filling it. And then on the other side of the tree, you have Geburah, which means strength or sometimes wrathful judgment. This is the quality of God contracting, pulling back from the universe, pulling back into himself, standing in opposition with the universe, which we might associate with judgment and with wrath. Below that we have Tifereth, or beauty, which serves to, in a certain sense, to reconcile the two Sephiroth above it. So Tifereth is associated with the individuality of God, and if you think about it, individuality is really a kind of mixture or a harmonization of expansion and contraction, or what we might think of as connection, relatedness, and separation. Saying, I am me, I am not this other person, even as I remain connected to other people and to the world. Then the current goes down to Netzach and Hod. There's relatively little about Netzach and Hod in traditional Kabbalah, but they play a very important role in Thelema. Netzach refers to the fire of aspiration, and Hod refers to the ordinary intellect. Below that we have Yesod, or foundation. Yesod is thought of in a sense as containing and concentrating the energy of the preceding Sephiroth. It's associated with the male sexual organ. And you can see that depicted somewhat on the diagram, as there is an energy sort of depending from Yesod down into existence, represented as Malkuth. Another name for Malkuth is Shekinah, or the presence of God. It was also thought of as the community of Israel itself. So, in other words, God's presence on earth is contingent upon a specific political and social structure. There's really nothing quite like that in Thelema. In Thelema, it has more of the connotation of the material universe or of physical existence. So another aspect that deserves mention is the Sephira of Da'ath, which means knowledge. Da'ath was added to the tree around the 13th century, probably as a means of reconciling Chokmah and Bina. We see that the spheres in the center of the tree generally serve a reconciling function. So in order to balance out that reconciling function, Da'ath was added. You can think of Da'ath as being something like the introduction of time. So everything, the top three Sephiroth they're not in time. They represent timeless eternity, whereas Da'ath is the introduction of time, which is actually pretty similar to how Da'ath is treated in Thelema. It's associated with Saturn. If you think of Kether as being something like eternity, then you might think of Da'ath as being something like the eternal now. Da'ath is important in certain aspects of esoteric Thelema, particularly with regard to the attainment called crossing the abyss. So Da'ath is in the center of a gap on the tree, which is known as the abyss. We're not going to be covering crossing the abyss in this talk, so for the most part we're not going to have to refer to Da'ath, but I wanted to mention it for the sake of completeness. Also important to the theory of Kabbalah is the theory of the four worlds. The four worlds are Atziluth, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asaya. Atziluth represents the timeless, eternal aspect of God. So that refers to Kether, Ein Sof. Bria refers to the archetypal world. It's an aspect of God which does undergo change. It's a little bit confusing because I said before that the top three Sephiroth are really outside of time. So what you're really thinking here of is something like process but without time. So it's a little bit difficult to get your mind around. Below that we have Yetzirah. This is the formed world. It is the world of pure spirits, the souls of planets and stars. This realm sort of constitutes the bread and butter of magical practice. So a lot of magical practice revolves around invoking the spirits or the energies of planets, elements, and zodiacal signs. So a lot of that visionary work is occurring in what we might call the realm of Yetzirah. And then finally we have the realm of Asaya, which is the created world. This is the sensible world where you encounter your vegetables, minerals, animals, and so forth. You'll notice that each one of these four worlds is associated with a Hebrew letter. So Atziluth with Yod, Bria with He, Yetzirah with Vav, and Asaya with He. Together these spell the name of Yehovah, or Tetragrammaton. So here we see Tetragrammaton spelled in full. Tetragrammaton is known as, in Thelema, as a god name or a name of God. Of God names in general, Crowley says, gods are the forces of nature. Their names are the laws of nature. Thus they are eternal, omnipotent, omnipresent, and so on. And thus their wills are immutable and absolute. So you can think of God names as being something like the intelligible aspect of a force. So the force acts, it produces an effect. The part of the force that we have insight into is the God name. And the God name usually spells out how the force behaves. So Tetragrammaton is one of these God names. And it is absolutely essential to an understanding of esoteric tarot and really of esoteric Thelema generally. So here we see the four letters of Tetragrammaton referred to the four worlds, as we've seen. They're also referred to the four elements. So Yod corresponds with fire, He with water, Vav with air, and He final with earth. And in the Tarot, each one of these is associated with a suit: wands, cups, swords, or discs. So we can also think of the four worlds this way, where instead of the four worlds being on one tree of life, we have a tree of life in each of the four worlds. And so combining that with the elements, we get an Atsaluthic world of pure fire, a Briatic world of pure water, a Yetziratic world of air, and in the world of Asaya, we have a purely earthy realm. This theory in and of itself is not that important, except when we're looking at the small cards in Tarot. So, as mentioned, each of the suits corresponds with one of the elements. And so, for example, if you look at the tree in Bria, all of the sixes on that tree go in the sphere of Tefereth on that tree. And all of the airy aces, the ace of swords, goes over in at the top of the tree in Yetzirah. The eight of discs goes over into the tree of Asaya at Hod. So we're not going to cover the small cards that much, but I'm adding this in here so that you understand how this works. A similar thing can be done with the court cards. So the knights refer to Hokmah, the queens to Binah, the princes to Tefereth, and the princesses to Malkuth. And so you do the same thing that you do with the numbered cards, where the Knight of Swords would be Hokmah in Yetzirah. So you can. This is another way that you can place Tetragrammaton on the Tree of Life, yet another one, where Yod goes up in Hokmah, He goes up in Binah, Val goes into Tefereth, and He final goes down in Malkuth. This arrangement is very important for what we're going to be looking at today, and it's very important for understanding the concept of initiation in Thelema. As mentioned, since we have each of the court cards associated with one of these Sephiroth as well, so if you combine them, you get something like this arrangement here. So you have the fiery part of fire is the Knight of Wands, the fiery part of air is the Knight of Swords, the Prince of Discs is the airy part of earth. So you're just combining two dimensions of elements. This is not going to be really essential to what we're looking at in this talk, but I'm adding it here just so you understand how it works and for the sake of completeness. So the process of the emanation of the Sephiroth that we've been looking at so far, the lightning bolt, how it moves through each of the spheres, we can think of this process or this development unfolding in a fashion which we might call dialectical. So dialectic comes from, has Greek roots. The Greek roots are dia or dia, which means through, and legein, which means to speak. So dialectic means to speak through. And something unfolds in a dialectical process if we can think of it as development driven by speech unfolding through being. We might think of it that way. Language plays a key role in creation in both the Jewish and the Christian traditions. So, for example, in the Gospel of John, we read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." So here we see this interesting sort of ambiguous relationship between the Word, Greek word for which is logos, which we're going to be talking about. So logos is both God and a particular tool of God. As the tool of God, it is the means by which God creates. Language is creative for God. And of course, this passage from the Gospel of John harkens back to the first chapter and verses of Genesis, which reads, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. So we see in these passages a really unique, interesting idea, which is the association of the ability. So you have the ability of God to create order, to create the habitable order of the universe, the cosmos, and that being associated essentially with some function of language. In the Christian tradition, the word is incarnated as a particular individual, but it is also the capacity of each individual to speak and to speak truth, and that is treated as a divine aspect of each person. And this association between the divinity in each person and the Logos is something that Crowley incorporates directly into Thelema without really changing it that much. We find in the Book of Thoth, for instance, when Crowley is talking about the Magus card, we read, "The French title of this card in the medieval pack is Le Batelier, the bearer of the baton. Mercury is preeminently the bearer of the wand, energy sent forth. This card therefore represents the wisdom, the will, the word, the Logos by whom the worlds were created. See the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 1. It represents the will. In brief, he is the Son, the manifestation in act of the idea of the Father." So in case there is any ambiguity at all in what Crowley's saying, he just says explicitly to look at the Gospel of John, chapter 1, which we just looked at. And he is associating, or really equating, this notion of Logos, of divine speech, with will, with true will, the central spiritual concept in Thelema itself. And in fact, Thelema is just named after will. The role of the intellect in spirituality is often misunderstood, especially in Thelema. We tend to think of the will as simply unintelligible. We think of it as something like an inchoate drive, maybe even something like a biological drive or the sex drive. And Crowley says things that certainly help this interpretation along. But things like biological drive really belong to what is called the nephesh, or the animal soul, which we might associate with the lower part of the tree of life. Whereas the will is explicitly associated with Kia, or which is associated with the sphere of Hokmah. In fact, Crowley explicitly says that it is wisdom, that it is Hokmah. So it's really something that's originating higher up the tree. But as we saw, or as we're going to see, language is active at all levels of existence, even the highest. It is often thought that, we often associate language with the intellectual capacity, and so we think of it in association with the Ruach. We haven't really talked about the parts of the soul so much, but the Ruach is basically the image-making faculty of the mind, is what Crowley calls it. You can think of it as just the ability of the mind to represent things. And the will comes from, the will transcends the Ruach. It transcends the thinking aspect of the mind. And so it's very important that the faculty of reason or the faculty of mind accurately represents will, but that it doesn't try to dictate will. This is one of the things that Crowley says in the commentaries. But this doesn't mean that the will isn't linguistic. It is. It is associated with Logos generally. Sometimes, on the other hand, Thelema will be approached as simply an intellectual exercise. A lot of people are drawn to Thelema because it has this sort of, quasi-academic, veneer to it. But that's not really the correct view at all. Language functions in Thelema in three primary ways. The first is as construction, or what Crowley calls silence and speech. The second as preservation, or silence. And the third as destruction, or speech in silence. And we're going to be looking into destruction and speech in silence a lot in this talk. But it's important to notice that, this is really the core spiritual function of language. It's operative through the entire tree. And the analytical or expository function of language, which we might associate with the ruach or the intellect in the normal sense, that function is parasitic on this more original sense of language, which is fundamentally both creative and destructive. And that's important. It is a type of speech which brings about its effects just by being spoken. So there's a certain immediacy between the word and the act or the deed, and also with being itself. We might say that from the perspective of Thelema, and even from the perspective of Kabbalah, that language is first and foremost incantation. It's a kind of magical speech. Dialectic also refers to the dynamic unity of opposites, especially as they are mediated by a third thing. So here you can see how the tree of life itself mediates between the two extremes of God. So on the one hand, you have the purely transcendent, mysterious, concealed aspect of God, which we have been calling Ein or Ein Sof. On the other hand, we have the manifest, revealed sense of God as a fully self-conscious being, which we have been calling Ani or I. And we can see how the tree is the third term that mediates between them, sharing aspects of both. Here we are looking again at the two sides or pillars of the tree of life and how they are mediated by the Sephiroth on what we're calling the middle pillar. So we've seen how Da'ath mediates between Chokmah and Bina, sort of draws together those two aspects into one being. Same thing with Tefereth. We saw how it mediates between Chesed and Geburah. And then you might assume a similar thing about the function of Yesod, mediating between the functions of Netzach and Hod. Dialectical method is really a part of Kabbalah from its origins. So, for example, in the 2nd century, we see Rabbi Ishael saying, 2 verses oppose one another until a third verse is brought to reconcile them. So if you run into a contradiction in the text, you search for a third verse that will help make sense of that contradiction. A third verse comes and reconciles the two. It is written, "Even darkness is not dark to you. Night shines like day. Light and darkness are the same." Again, hearkening back to the identity between being and nothingness that we saw before, which is really at the root or the origin of the whole notion of Kabbalah itself. Kabbalah is based upon an identity of opposites, which is characteristic of dialectical process. Part of the Kabbalistic theory is that before the fall, Adam was a cosmic being containing the entire world within himself. So you might think of him as being the primal unity, like Kether, as we were looking at, or even Ein or Ein Sof. And by eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he knew separation and turned away from divine unity. So you can think of that as emanating down into the spheres of the tree of life, undergoing opposition, undergoing dynamism, undergoing change and process. But by manipulating the language of Adam, we can recover the wisdom that he possessed and lost during the fall. And to recover that wisdom is to overcome that separation from divine. So we are seeing here an outline of the process of return, the process of initiation, of moving back up the tree toward the divine source, and a kind of recovery of the initial essence of God himself. So God spoke Hebrew, as it turns out. Here we have the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. As you can see, each letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a meaning in English. Aleph means ox, Beth means house, etc. Also, each Hebrew letter stands for a number. So, Hebrew does not have separate characters for numbers. So, if you wanted to do math in Hebrew, you would just use the letters, and the context would determine that they were being used as numbers. It also implies that every word in Hebrew has a numerical value, and this is very important to aspects of esoteric Thelema. We're not going to cover them so much in this talk, but it's extremely useful to know these number associations, and that's putting it somewhat mildly. So this is worth just committing to memory. So each path on the tree of life, the paths were the connecting lines between the Sephiroth. Each path on the tree of life is associated with particular colors, an element, planet, or zodiacal sign, and further esoteric meanings. Each path also has a letter of the Hebrew alphabet associated with it. Furthermore, each card of the Major Arcana has a Hebrew letter associated with it. And therefore, each Tarot card, each Major Arcana card, represents the esoteric meaning of one of those paths. So, in order to understand initiation in Thelema, and in order to understand how the cards represent that, we have to consider again the formula of Tetragrammaton. Tetragrammaton is an extremely multivalent formula. It has many, many applications within the context of Thelema. And that makes it absolutely essential for an understanding of Thelemic mysticism and of magic. So the formula begins with the division out of Kether of a father principle associated with Chokmah and the letter Yod, and a mother principle associated with Binah and the letter He. They in turn have two children, so to speak. A son associated with Tefereth and the letter Vav, and a daughter associated with Malkuth and the letter He final. So the son, or Vav, must marry the daughter, He. To do this, he raises her up the tree from Malkuth into the sphere of Tefereth. In Tefereth, they are married. This marriage is called Hieros Gamos, or sacred marriage. Once they're married, the children ascend into the supernal triad, where they rejoin the father and the mother. In particular, this movement of He final into the sphere of Binah Crowley refers to repeatedly as the virgin being seated on the throne of the mother. This concept is extremely important in Thelema. Now, at this point, you can think of them as either being reabsorbed by the father and the mother, or you can think of them as becoming the new father and mother. But in either case, what's important is that the cycle is starting over. So Tetragrammaton is a cyclical process, and we're going to look soon at in more detail of what that means. So let's fill this in with some examples. let's think about how this works in the Gnostic Mass. So, after being consecrated by the priestess, the priest raises her to the summit of the earth, or to Binah. We're going to talk much more in a moment about what this concept of the summit of the earth means and the idea of the spiritual mountain. But suffice to say, at the moment, he's referring to Binah here, and by placing her on the Gnostic Mass altar, he's placing her on Binah. So that makes her He, and it makes him Yod. Now in part 6 of the Mass, the priest identifies the host and the cup of wine with himself and with the priestess, thereby making them their children, so to speak. He refers to the host as the essence of the life of the sun, which makes it Vow, and associates it with Tefereth. And the wine he refers to as the essence of the joy of the earth, thereby associating it with He final, the daughter, and Malkuth. So you can think of the particle of the host as being married, so to speak, with the wine, thereby affecting the hierosgamos, or sacred marriage, that we referred to a moment ago. And this happens in part 8 of the Mass, the title of which is The Mystic Marriage and Consummation of the Elements. It's very important because sometimes people think that the mystic marriage is occurring between the priest and priestess directly, and that's not the case. It says it right in the title of that section. It's between the elements of the Eucharist. The children are then sacrificed, so to speak. They're eaten by the priest. So now let's consider the same formula in the context of initiation, which is really going to be our focus from here on out. In the process of initiation, you have a candidate, or what we might call an aspirant, somebody who desires initiation, who desires to know God directly, or who desires to know fundamental reality directly. That candidate, or aspirant, is associated with He final, or the daughter, at the bottom of the tree in Malkuth. The holy guardian angel of that individual is the son, or Vow, in Tefereth. We're going to talk a lot more tonight about this notion of the angel, but just take it for granted now that it is something like a spiritual guide which helps bring the candidate up the tree. So the candidate, or the aspirant, must raise herself up the tree of life by a process of purification and prayer in order to join the holy guardian angel in Tefereth. And in Tefereth, they are wedded. This wedding, or sacred marriage, is referred to as the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. And now we see an intermediate stage here called Babe of the Abyss. So the angel, so to speak, leads the aspirant to the edge of the abyss, which is in Chesed. So we haven't spoken much about the abyss. The abyss is a gap between the real and the ideal, between those lower 7 Sephiroth and the upper 3. And crossing the abyss is one of the major attainments in Crowley's system of AA. So here we have angel and aspirant on the edge of the abyss. And then if the abyss crossing is successful, the aspirant becomes master of the temple. The daughter, or the candidate, so to speak, has now been seated on the throne of the mother at Binah. The angel takes up his place at Chokmah, and so we're back to where we started. This process that I just described is dramatized in the Wake World, which is really essential reading if you want to understand initiation in the context of Thelema and how it relates to these, how it's expressed in these formulas. At the end of the wake world, the candidate, whose name is Lola, once she gets up to Binah, she is pregnant at that point. And you can think of that as the master of the temple being pregnant with new students. In other words, there are now new aspirants who need to be guided up the tree or shown how to make contact with their angels to get up to the tree. This is actually an essential part of Thelema, this idea of creating a school and of helping more and more people cross the abyss. So this process that I just described, the formula of Tetragrammaton as exemplified in initiation, it's broken out into 3 grades by Crowley. And these grades are outlined in a book called Liber Tov. And I've represented them, the content of Liber Tov here in these diagrams. So what you can see here is that there's 3 grades. There's Neophyte, there's Adeptus, and there's Magister Templi. And each one is associated with an illusion that has to be overcome. It's associated with a core function of speech. So we were talking about the 3 functions of speech before. It is associated with a particular unveiling. It's associated with a particular equilibrium, something that has to be balanced in order to proceed. It is associated with a particular ritual of initiation. And probably most importantly for what we're going to look at tonight, it is associated with a particular ordeal. So the grade of Neophyte is associated with the ordeal of resurrection. The ordeal of Adeptus is associated with the ordeal of death. And the grade of Magister Templi is associated with the ordeal of birth. So here we see the grade of Neophyte. So Neophyte applies to everything that occurs below Tefereth on the Tree of Life. It's a little bit confusing because there is a subgrade of Neophyte which is also called Neophyte. It's the one all the way at the bottom, which is in Malkuth. So the grade of Neophyte as a whole is divided into these 4 subgrades of Neophyte, Zealiter, Practicus, and Philosophus. When I talk about the grade of Neophyte or the work of Neophyte in this talk, I'm principally talking about the spiritual attainments that apply below Tefereth. So I'm not going to speak so much about the subgrade of Neophyte. So when you hear me talk about Neophyte, keep in mind that I'm talking about the entire spiritual process represented by these colored interconnecting lines here. I'm talking about all of the work that occurs prior to knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. So you can think of these 4 grades as being like, the 4 subgrades, as being like 4 sides of a single pyramid. So you're building up a pyramid, and then the capstone of that pyramid is going to be knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. But once one attains knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, one is no longer a Neophyte, but an Adeptus. So that's knowledge and conversation is not part of the work of the Neophyte, it's the work leading up to it. There is an attainment, a spiritual attainment appropriate to Neophyte, and that is called the vision of the Holy Guardian Angel. So we're going to be talking a lot about the vision of the Holy Guardian Angel, which is not to be confused with knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. As mentioned, the work of the Neophyte is represented by the paths on the Tree of Life between Malkuth and Tefereth. You see them here represented with their king scale colors. Each path is associated with a Hebrew letter, as we've seen, a spiritual insight, a set of spiritual tasks, and, apropos of this talk, a Major Arcana card. The diagram that you see here is a reproduction of one which Crowley includes in Liber 13 Vel Graduum Montis Abiegni, which means Book 13, or Steps on the Mountain Abiegnis. Abiegnis is the figurative spiritual mountain from the Rosicrucian tradition. Crowley is adapting this idea of the spiritual mountain for the idea of spiritual work in Thelema. Of this spiritual mountain, I want to quote a passage from Chick Cicero's The Rosicrucian Vault. Quote, "The symbolism of the mountain and the cavern played an important role in the Rosicrucian teachings of the Golden Dawn. In the Adeptus Minor ritual, it states that the tomb of Christian Rosenkreutz is symbolically situated in the center of the earth, in the mountain of the caverns, the mystic mountain of Abiegnis. This is the mythical mountain that is both heavenly and subterranean. Mount Abiegnis symbolizes the spiritual journey of the initiate, who must scale its heights and also find the spiritual treasure deep within the mountain. In Latin, Mons Abiegnis means fir tree covered mountain. However, the Golden Dawn gave the name Abiegnis a much more elaborate meaning, involving a complex wordplay of Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. In the Adeptus Minor ritual, it states, the meaning of this title of Abiegnis, Abi Agnus, Lamb of the Father. It is by metathesis Abi Genos, born of the Father, Bia Genos, strength of our race. And the four words make the sentence Abiegnis, Abiagnus, Abigenos, Biagenos, mountain of the Lamb of the Father and the strength of our race. I-A-O, Yeshua, such are the words. Now, Yeshua is the divine name of Jesus associated with the Christian Kabbalah. It is the divine name of the God of the Old Testament, Yod-He-Vav-He, who we were looking at before, with the Hebrew letter Shin, which signifies spirit, in the center of it. So the name then spells Yod-He, Shin, Vav-He, Yeshua. And that thereby transforms the Tetragrammaton, or the four-lettered name of God, into the Pentagrammaton, or the five-lettered name of the Redeemer. In the Golden Dawn system, I-A-O is a reference to the cycle of life, death, and resurrection from death. So it's important to note for some historical context that the Golden Dawn, which is the system that Crowley came through in his 20s, used a similar system of spiritual gradation involving the Tree of Life and the Sephiroth and the Paths. That system of initiations climaxed at Tefereth with the Adeptus Minor ritual. And you can see that on Crowley's diagram, Adeptus Minor is still at Tefereth. That ritual symbolically took place in the vault of the adepts in the heart of Abiegnis, the spiritual mountain. It was a ritual of resurrection and of triumphing over death. Its formulae, or god names, were Inri, I-N-R-I, Lux, L-V-X, and Iao, I-A-O. The ritual had a very strong Christian motif. One overcame death by identifying with the suffering of Jesus Christ. And by identifying with his death and with his resurrection, one triumphed over death personally. The Thelemic system of initiation is defined as much by what it keeps as by what it discards. In Thelema, Tefereth, or the Adeptus, is no longer associated with resurrection, but, as we saw a moment ago, with death. Resurrection is now the ordeal of the neophyte. So in other words, this entire diagram that we're looking at here with the interconnected paths, this symbolizes in some sense a drama of resurrection, whereas everything at Tefereth and the paths immediately above have to do with death. As a result, the magical formula of resurrection, LVX, is now moved down to Malkuth. And from a practical point of view, all of the Golden Dawn work of magic that was taught in their second order, that is, up at Adeptus Minor, is now taught in the subgrade of Neophyte. INRI has been discarded from this ritual. One does not triumph over death by identifying with the suffering God. One now triumphs by transcending suffering, not by enduring it. And we're going to look in detail at what that means. The vault of the spiritual mountain is no longer in Tefereth, but is now in Binah. And that vault is no longer opened by LVX, but by NOX, or Nox. In other words, the supreme spiritual attainment is no longer one of spiritual light, but of spiritual darkness. Now make no mistake, spiritual darkness does not mean evil, or the rejection of transcendence, or the rejection of spirituality. In the Golden Dawn system, it tended to represent the blind forces of matter. It doesn't have that meaning here either. Crowley's word for the blind forces of matter is Qliphoth, which we're going to look at momentarily. The clue is to be found in the word Nox itself, which enumerates to 210. 210. 2 represents duality, 1 represents unity, 0 represents nothingness. Duality reduced to unity, reduced to the negative. Spiritual ascension in this system is identical with a return to direct knowledge of the Kabbalistic source, Ein or Ein Sof. It is about reclaiming the original wisdom of Adam, so to speak. Kabbalah is not part of Thelema. Thelema is a form of Kabbalah. The spiritual aim of this system is aiming at what you can think of as a very traditional Kabbalistic idea, which is this idea of the mysterious, transcendent, withdrawn aspect of God, which we looked at earlier, and we're calling Ein or Ein Sof, nothing or being or infinity. But as we saw earlier, this nothingness or this infinity is not self-sufficient, but is at one with its manifestations. It necessarily, through a primordial urge, erupts into being. This idea of the unity of opposites is retained in Thelema itself. And this idea helps us make sense of passages like the following from Liber Tzadi. Quote, "Many have arisen, being wise. They have said, 'Seek out the glittering image in the place ever golden, and unite yourselves with it.' Many have arisen, being foolish. They have said, 'Stoop down unto the darkly splendid world, and be wedded to that blind creature of the slime.' I, who am beyond wisdom and folly, arise and say unto you, achieve both weddings. Unite yourselves with both. Beware, beware, I say, lest ye seek after the one and lose the other. My adepts stand upright, their head above the heavens, their feet below the hells." So at long last, we arrive at a tarot card. Here we are looking at the Universe card. This is attributed to the path of Thoth, which we see highlighted on the tree in its king scale color of indigo. Thoth is attributed to Saturn and to the god Osiris, the black god, who was associated with the black soil of the Nile Valley of Egypt. This also brings to mind the Aeon of Osiris, whose principal formula of initiation was, according to Crowley, E-A-O, which symbolizes birth, death, and resurrection. I stands for Isis, so that symbolizes birth. A stands for Apophis Typhon, so death or destruction. And O stands for Osiris Risen, resurrection. In the Aeon of the Child, the formula is exactly reversed. So we saw that the neophyte grade, its ordeal was resurrection, or O. We saw that the ordeal of Adeptus was death, so that's A. And we saw that the ordeal of Magister Templi was birth, that's I. So the formula is now O-A-I instead of I-A-O. But it hasn't been simply reversed. The individual elements of it now have slightly different meanings. Well, in some cases, more than slightly different meanings, which we're going to be looking at throughout the course of this talk. We see the serpent depicted prominently in this card. The serpent can be thought of as referring to the Kundalini force, which is a pranic force which is coiled at the base of the spine in the Muladhara chakra. Through spiritual practices, this energy, this Kundalini force, rises up the Sushumna channel, and when it reaches the top of this channel at the crown, then knowledge and conversation has occurred. One has passed to Adeptus. The awakening of this serpent is the vision of the Holy Guardian Angel, which is the attainment of neophyte that I mentioned earlier. So, for example, in Liber 65, we read, "Rise, O my snake, it is now is the hour of the hooded and holy ineffable flower. Rise, O my snake, into brilliance of bloom, on the corpse of Osiris, afloat in the tomb." The serpent is, importantly, an object of fear. People are sort of programmed to fear snakes because not only are they poisonous, but they lurk unseen in the grass, they're quiet, they can drop down out of trees. So there's also the element of surprise here, mixed with a deadly force. For this very reason, snakes tend to be associated with consciousness. You have to be on the lookout for snakes. You have to make sure you keep your awareness sharp so that you can see a movement which is characteristic of a snake so that you can avoid it, basically. It was probably for this reason that it is the serpent in the Garden of Eden that gets Eve to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Serpent is associated with awareness of consciousness and all the problems that come along with that. The answer to life, or the answer to fearful things in life, is to not try to avoid what's fearful, since you can't. Life is inherently dangerous. There are things to be afraid of in life. The way to deal with this is to approach life courageously, with eyes open. We're going to talk a bit in a moment about what full awareness means in the context of this system of initiation and how that gets represented in the cards. The serpent is poisonous. Its fangs contain venom. And as it turns out, the work of the outer college, the work of neophyte, which we're looking at here, is destruction. We're going to look at what this means in some detail. We also see a woman depicted here. This is a depiction of the daughter, Malkuth. We see that her legs are in the shape of a cross. Another name of this path is Tau, which means cross. We can think of the cross as representing the four elements, which we saw were associated with the four letters of Tetragrammaton. We can also think of the cross as associated with consciousness, and therefore with Hadit. Hadit starts down in Malkuth at the subgrade of Neophyte, and gradually ascends the tree to unity with God. Meanwhile, Nuit can be thought of as descending the tree to meet the candidate. So you might notice that there are these odd depictions of the subgrades, things like 1 equals 10, 2 equals 9, etc. And there's a little circle and a little square in there. You can think of those as being the two aspects of Nuit and Hadit coming together. Consciousness ascending to the divine descending to consciousness. The cross is no longer a symbol of purification through suffering. As mentioned before, we now transcend suffering. We do not undergo it. Transcending suffering does not mean the rejection of self-sacrifice or of hard work. On the contrary, the spiritual work that we're going to be looking at here requires tremendous grit. There is simply no longer a glorification of suffering or of self-loss for its own sake. Suffering in and of itself does not redeem. We're going to return to this notion of redemption later and see how it relates to the formula of Tetragrammaton that we were looking at a little while ago. But suffice to say, existence itself no longer requires redemption at all. And Crowley represented this by making the color of Malkuth emerald green, which we see represented in the back. Again, this doesn't mean that we don't have to answer for ourselves or that we don't have to improve ourselves through self-sacrifice. We absolutely do. The way that I interpret this is, it goes back to what I was saying much earlier in this talk, that Malkuth already is the completely realized self-consciousness of God. The divine is already present with us here. In a certain sense, nothing really has to be done. God is fine. Reality is fine as it is. All that we can really do as candidates is to go through that process which God or the soul, however you want to look at it, has already gone through. And so in a certain sense, you can view this as a process of recollection, of going back through the pages whereby God came into full manifestation. But have no doubt, the fully realized aspect of God is all the way down here in Malkuth. The world itself already is divine, even in all of its ambiguity and conflict and strife and all the things about life that are difficult. It requires no external justification. Again, we read in Liber Tzadi, I fly and I alight as an hawk. Of mother of emerald are my mighty sweeping wings. I swoop down upon the black earth, and it gladdens into green at my coming. Children of earth, rejoice, rejoice exceedingly, for your salvation is at hand. Here we see the Aeon card, which is attributed to the path of Sheen, connecting Malkuth with Hod. This card used to be called Judgment in the Golden Dawn deck. I don't have a picture of it here, but you're probably familiar with the motif. It depicts an angel blowing a trumpet, and then you see corpses coming up out of their graves and rising up into the sky. It's based on a passage from 1 Corinthians in which Paul says, Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. So in other words, the card dealt with the issue of resurrection, overcoming death through resurrection, the transition from death to life. And this was represented by the 5th letter of Pentagrammaton, which, as I've said, is Sheen, which is the path that this is referring to. And as mentioned, there was this notion of the descent of spirit, or the descent of the letter Sheen, into the mists of the 4 elements represented by the 4 letters of Pentagrammaton to form the name of the Redeemer, Yahshua. In the new aeon, the letter Sheen still has the connotation of resurrection. And as I've mentioned a few times now, the first ordeal of initiation, the ordeal of the neophyte in general, is the ordeal of resurrection. But the symbology and the meaning of resurrection is now different. It doesn't mean what it did before. And we can tell this because the ordeal which immediately follows resurrection is not life, but rather death. So what does resurrection mean now? Well, the answer can be found, or suggested at least, in the art of this card itself. So we see that the card depicts Nuit in the background, in blue. We see Hadit about a third of the way up from the bottom, the winged solar disk. We see Rahor Kuit in the background, seated on a throne. And in the foreground, as a sort of transparency or ghostly figure, we see Horpakrat. So we see the major deities here of the new aeon, of Thelema. The shape of Nuit and Hadit together suggest the shape of the symbol of Libra. Libra is the balance, the zodiacal sign represented by the balance. Altogether, the card is suggestive of awakening divinity within as a result of balancing the four elements, not the descent of spirit into matter. Spirit doesn't have to come from the outside to redeem us. Every man and every woman is a star. The Cobbs is in the coup, not the coup in the Cobbs. The divine light is already inside of us. The process of salvation is no longer one of being saved by something from the outside, but rather the awakening of something from within. The primary metaphor now is waking up, not something descending from above to pull us up. The four elements are now the four powers of the Sphinx, which are the main powers of the magician. We saw these depicted in the universe card a moment ago. What this means is that the four powers of the Sphinx are to know, to will, to dare, and to keep silent, and each one corresponds with one of the elements. So knowledge corresponds with air, daring with water, willing with fire, and silence with earth. So the idea here is that we are transforming our relationship with the elements that compose our being and that compose the world around us, so that they become the tools by means of which we ascend. So we're not dealing here anymore with the idea of escaping from the prison of matter. The elements themselves are going to become the means by which we transcend. Also, the angel. So we've spoken a little bit so far of the Holy Guardian Angel, but the idea of the angel's effect on the candidate or the aspirant is not so much to save the candidate. The candidate has to save themselves, really. They have to transform their own relationship with themselves. They have to transform their own relationship with existence. They have to come into contact with the light within them. Like, nobody can do this for you except yourself. You have to do this through your own effort, through your own grit, your own determination, your own process of prayer and purification. Now, I mentioned the Tetragrammaton. So you have the four powers of the Sphinx corresponding with the four elements, with the fifth letter, Sheen, coming in. That also corresponds with a power. But it corresponds now with what Crowley calls the fifth power of the Sphinx, which is ire, which is to go. So while the other four powers have to do with the elements as they appear within experience, the fifth power is not an element within experience. It is going itself. In other words, it is Hadit, or the God within, which is not a thing or an object or even a static desire, but rather a process, something which is constantly moving and changing, and therefore its primary mode of being is to not be what it is, or to just simply be the negation of itself. So what we're looking at here is a picture of illumination from within that gives knowledge of the state of torpor, or the state of being encased in matter, which has to be overcome through a process of conscious transformation of experience. In the Book of the Law we read, "I am the magician and the exorcist. I am the axle of the wheel, and the cube and the circle. Come unto me is a foolish word, for it is I that go. I am the flame that burns in every heart of man, and in the core of every star. I am life and the giver of life, yet therefore is the knowledge of me the knowledge of death." Now we come to the Sun card and the path of Resh, which connects Yesod with Hod. Resh means head. We see depicted in this card the sun shining gloriously over a green mound. The sun figures prominently in Thelema. Thelema has been described by Crowley as a solar phallic cult. Its main deity, or one of its main deities, is Ra-Hoor-Khuit, who is a solar deity, a solar and martial deity, actually. Thelemites practice Liber-Resh, which is a fourfold sun adoration. The sun features prominently in the Gnostic Mass, and also in many other rituals and many other writings by Crowley. What is the spiritual significance of the sun? What justifies its prominence in Thelema? Well, we might think of the sun as a symbol of consciousness. Consciousness or awareness is integral to Thelema. We know this because one of the symbols of Thelema is the eye in the triangle. So if you look at the cover of the Equinox, you'll see the eye in the triangle at the top. It's also depicted in the Laman of OTO. The lidless eye symbolizes awareness. It symbolizes being awake, being aware. At the heart of Thelema is a kind of awareness or awakeness, as opposed to being asleep. The sun we might think of as a symbol of that consciousness manifested in time. So the lidless eye is something like a timeless consciousness, or an ideal principle, something which is at the pinnacle of our religion. But then the question becomes, how should that more abstract sense of spiritual consciousness find itself manifested in time? Or in the language of Logos that we were looking at before, how should the word become flesh? How do we know that the word has become flesh? What does that even mean in the new aeon? The story of Horus gives us some clues. So in the story of Horus, the figure of Osiris is very important. Osiris represents the father, or is the father figure. Osiris represents culture. It's the tradition that we find ourselves in. We are not born into a vacuum. We are born into a society, into a political structure, sometimes a religious structure, all of which have a kind of history. And so we find ourselves in the midst of the result of history, of a lot of accomplishments. And all institutions, whether they be religious, social, or political, are a mixture of various ideals, on the one hand, a certain purpose, and a certain level of corruption on the other. A certain level of corruption is just simply ineradicable. in all institutions, simply because humans are fallible. So in the story of Horus, Osiris has become old and weak. So we might think of this as being a system or a tradition or an institution in decay, something which no longer has the perspicacity to see its purpose, and so it has become oblivious in a certain way to corruption, and so it is now it's now vulnerable to it. And this is symbolized in this story by Osiris's vulnerability to Set. And so, the story goes that Set murders Osiris. And in some of these versions, he even goes so far as to chop him up into pieces and to just scatter the pieces around in Egypt. So a complete dismemberment. This prompts the return of Isis, who is a symbol of nature. She manages to reassemble these pieces of Osiris, except for the phallus. In some cases, she creates a magical phallus, and she conceives Horus with the reassembled Osiris. Horus attempts to avenge his father, but in his battle with Set, he loses his eye. So the loss of the eye, so Horus is a bird of prey, is a raptor. And raptors have extremely keen eyesight. They're very dependent on their eyesight, just as human beings are. And so you can imagine that the loss of an eye for Horus would be about as devastating as, a human being losing an eye. I think that the loss of the eye is meant to symbolize something like how much you could possibly lose without actually being killed. It's probably something like that. You can imagine maybe castration being another similar metaphor. But rather than being glorified by his injuries, as Jesus is, Horus triumphs in spite of his injuries. And after a series of contests, he actually prevails over Set. Importantly to the story, Set is not killed, but banished. This is important because I think it shows an insight that the Egyptians had, which is that we're always going to be susceptible to the forces of Set in many, many different ways. All institutions are going to be susceptible to corruption. And if that corruption gets far enough out of hand, things can get real evil can overtake things. Governments can be turned into tyrannies. Churches can give over to persecution and dogma and commit real harm. But the same thing goes for individuals. Each of us has Set within ourselves. All human beings have a destructive capacity within themselves. And it is important that we not lose sight of that. And there are a few main reasons why we shouldn't lose sight of it. One of them is that we're just deceiving ourselves if we think we don't have this capacity within us. If we're not acutely aware of the capacity for destruction within ourselves, that doesn't simply make it go away. We're constantly tempted to do things that are going to be, let's say, inauthentic to ourselves, that take us off our paths. But we also, each of us, have real capacities for destruction and for mayhem. And so we lose sight of this within ourselves at our own peril. And so we don't want to accidentally unleash this on people at the wrong moment. You don't want to have some kind of, outburst at work. You want to be able to deal with these feelings of aggression and not just simply make believe that they're not there. You don't want these things to come out in unhealthy ways in relationships. You don't want to accumulate tons of resentment. as a result of not dealing with anger and aggression appropriately. So it's very important. But there's a second reason why we need to remain in touch with this sort of set power within ourselves. And that's because it is a power. It is an ability. Each of us has a killer within us. And I don't necessarily mean that in the sense that, well, no, I do necessarily mean that in the sense that each of us has the ability to kill. Somewhere in us. Humans are extremely dangerous animals. And, society can, prompt us to lose track of that and to make believe that it's not there. But of course it is. And it's a real asset. If you look at the story of Horus, Horus is not a martyr. Horus doesn't turn the other cheek. There is nothing in the Horus story about the meek inheriting the earth. Horus deals with his loss by simply by carrying it in a certain sense. And in that sense, it does have something in common with the Jesus mythology, because in that mythology you have the idea of carrying the cross as a metaphor for owning your suffering, or owning existence, let's say, the condition of existence itself. And there is something like that in the Horus story, of course, because Horus undergoes as profound a loss as we can imagine without losing your life, and yet he bears it in such a way that he triumphs despite it. And I think even in certain parts, I think even in certain versions of the story, he reclaims the eye and maybe gives it to Osiris in the underworld. I'm not entirely sure. But to return to the idea of Set, if we accept that there are people in the world who are, if we accept that Set exists out there in the world, if we accept that there are really dangerous, malevolent people in the world, which there certainly are. There are people who are running around and they're just looking for ways to make things worse. Well, the way to deal with that is twofold. One, you need to cultivate your awareness, right? You need to be, as we were talking about earlier, you need to keep your eyes open and not be naive, especially if you only have one eye left. You damn well better use it. That's the first thing. And secondly, you better have a capacity to fight back. You better have a capacity within yourself to stand up for yourself and to be able to utilize that aggression and utilize that ability to that same power which might lead a person to kill. And of course, I'm not suggesting that you ought to become a literal murderer. What I am suggesting is that you cultivate a certain level of toughness. And you cultivate a certain courage, really. And a certain willingness to use aggression, which will signal to people around you that they had better not fuck with you. And if people around you know that they had better not fuck with you just because of how you carry yourself, well, then you're never going to have to use your aggression. And you can use that aggression, and it doesn't have to be physical aggression. You might just simply, look people in the eye, or, speak with a certain confidence about the things that you know, and have the courage to say when you don't know something, and to use your powers of criticism and your verbal abilities, and to make yourself more knowledgeable and just more capable in general. That might be enough. Fear not at all. Fear neither men, nor fates, nor gods, nor anything. Money fear not, nor laughter of the folk folly, nor any other power in heaven, or upon the earth, or under the earth. New is your refuge, as Hadit your light, and I am the strength, force, vigor of your arms. Thou shalt have danger and trouble, Ra-Hor-Ku is with thee. The sun represents the divine individual, the Logos made flesh. Or, looked at from the other angle, the individual doing their true will. What we're seeing in the image of the sun is what that looks like in the flesh. And the fact that Horus is so central to our religion, I think, signifies that it is pulling together both of these currents, the light and the dark. It is as much about being in touch with those dark Setian qualities, so to speak, as it is about being in touch with these sort of lighter aspects. The purpose of consciousness is to illuminate what is unconscious, to allow us to move across the divide between consciousness and the shadow. This, in essence, means that part of our spiritual path involves a descent into the underworld. You might think of this as a reclamation of the Father or a reclamation of tradition. It means the reclamation of the world that we're born into so that we can put the spark of awareness and vitality back into it. We can give its eyesight back to it. We can make it conscious again. We primarily do this by being forthright, by being honest, and by giving our criticism when appropriate. According to tradition, the sun is said to be in its completed or its perfected state after passing into the west, the land of Amenti, the land of the dead, the land of Osiris, the Father. It is only by passing into the realm of the Father that the sun achieves his full end. He becomes master of both life and of death, which we will look at momentarily. This means the utilization of change for the purpose of self-fulfillment, the utilization of darkness and the power of Set to complete individuality. Time does not mean the destruction of the individual, but the realization of the individual. I am light and I am night, and I am that which is beyond them. I am speech and I am silence, and I am that which is beyond them. I am life and I am death, and I am that which is beyond them. I am war and I am peace, and I am that which is beyond them. I am weakness and I am strength, and I am that which is beyond them. Yet by none of these can man reach up to me. Yet by each of them must man reach up to me. The moon card is associated with Pisces and the path of Thoth. Crowley refers to Pisces as the gateway of resurrection. So we're continuing with our resurrection theme here, which is the ordeal of the neophyte. This card represents the sun at midnight. So we see we're looking west here. It's associated with Kefra, the beetle, who we see carrying the sun. We also see depicted Anubis, two Anubises, Anubi, if you will. Anubis was the embalmer of Osiris. So again, continuing with the Osirian theme. In the center of the card, we see 9 yods. Crowley describes these as 9 drops of impure blood, which fall upon the barren landscape. They're falling from the moon, which we see at the top of the card. So what we can see here is something like a revivification happening. Life being breathed back into something, or that being manifested as these drops of blood which are falling. And we can see the glimmers of the sun below the horizon indicating the light which we'll soon experience. This path is associated with equilibration among the shells. So by shells, he means Qliphoth. You might be familiar with the notion of the Qliphoth as demons, as Qliphotic demons. That's not the meaning that it has in Thelema. Qliphoth just means, I think it just means bark. So you might think of a piece of wood that has bark on it and you want to transform it into something, and so naturally the first thing you do is you take a knife and you scrape the bark off of it. You get the bark off of the thing. And so this is actually an apt metaphor for what attainment is like in this system. Because remember that the divinity comes to us not from without, but from within. It's really just a question of removing those obstacles from the outside. Or I should say that's at least one part of it. There's also the aspect of inflaming oneself in prayer, which is the activation of this divinity within. But equally important is the clarification of our awareness of that divinity. And that really comes about through something like a process of purification, which has to do with, you can sort of think of here of like a metaphor of a lamp, and the glass on the lamp is very dirty, and so you have to clean off the dirt on the outside of the lamp so that the light can shine outward. There's also this idea in Thelema of the coup and the cobs. So the passage in the Book of the Law says the cobs is in the coup, not the coup in the cobs. So the cobs is the divine self. It's the house of Hadit. It is the part of ourselves that we truly are, but that we tend not to identify with. We tend to identify with the coup. And the coup, Crowley describes as the magical garment, which is kind of a colorful way, I think, of just talking about what in Buddhism are called the skandhas. So the skandhas, or the heaps, as they're called, or the aggregates, are merely just aspects of experience that we mistakenly take for self, or that we mistakenly take for to be permanent. And the skandhas include things like your sensual perceptions. They include the estimation of things being like good, neutral, or bad. They include thoughts. So your thoughts are, strictly speaking, not you. And it also includes consciousness. You might think that you are identical with your consciousness, but according to Buddhist doctrine and Buddhist practice, for that matter, you are not. You're supposed to try to see through that as well. And we can think of the skandhas as being as being those things that are sort of occluding the light of the true self, because we're constantly mistaking the skandhas or the objects of experience for the experiencer. And so there is kind of this sort of traditional Buddhist notion in Crowley's notion of awakening. And I think just as the skandhas don't go away once you are enlightened, it's not as though matter goes away just because you achieve enlightenment in this particular system. You're not completely free of matter. What you can do is transform your relationship with it. And that's largely what this practice is about. A large part of this practice is achieving balance in our perceptions. And so training ourselves not to make those distinctions between good, neutral, and bad, but to approach all things on their own terms. And in that sense, we transcend our embodied existence, and we attain to something like a spiritual indifference, what in ancient times was called ataraxia. And so there's a lot of parallels here between what Crowley is trying to do, the school of ancient skepticism, and also arguably Buddhism. We can also think of this on analogy with an alchemical process that the candidate is going through. The stage that we're looking at now, the whole neophyte stage in general, we might think of as the Negredo stage of the alchemical process, the stage in which the first matter is made black. And we can think of that process and of this card in particular as representing what some people know as Dark Night of the Soul. So the Dark Night of the Soul is this, well, it's something that shows up in a few different traditions. It's probably been spelled out best in the Christian mystical tradition, but there's also a parallel to it in the Buddhist tradition. It shows up in different ways for different people, but basically what happens is that you're initially in love with your spiritual practice. You make very quick progress when you start a spiritual practice, just like you do with anything. Just like in weightlifting, there's beginner's gains. You get the exact same thing from spiritual practice. And then, a lot of the things you might experience at the beginning are, increased energy, increased awareness, increased perception. You might feel closer to the divine. You might even get things like Kundalini type phenomena, energy moving up and down the spine. You might start to get phenomena like magical powers, things like being able to see through closed eyelids, feeling the body sort of atomize and break apart, a sense of oneness with the universe, increased sex drive. Or maybe the sex drive going away altogether, in the sense that you have somehow transcended all of that. It can show up in so many different ways. This is the initial spiritual opening that happens with a lot of different intense practices, or practices that involve concentration. But then this has a tendency to give way to something like the opposite, or the recoil effect, which is dark night of the soul. And so what happens here is that, like, one of the most common effects is spiritual dryness. So the connection with the divine is seemingly lost. You do the practices, but don't get the same cool effects that you had before. The practice itself might start to feel intolerable, like it's painful to do. More extreme things that happen could be a sense that you are dying, a sense that you have lost yourself or your soul, a sense that the cause of your problem is your material existence, and so you have to reject society, and you have to reject your job, and you have to go and join a monastery, or go live out in a shack in the desert, or something of that nature. A complete rejection of relationships. You might mistakenly think that your relationship with your boyfriend or girlfriend is causing these problems, and so the mind is constantly looking for things outside as the culprit here, when in fact this is just a normal process of spiritual enlightenment that happens. It's like, the mind notices suddenly all of the divine aspects of existence, and then as perception becomes stronger and more refined, you start to notice the suffering aspects of existence as well, the parts that aren't so cool. And you're noticing them on a fundamental level. You're experiencing something like a fundamental dis-ease, or a fundamental suffering, if you will. And it's actually a positive sign. And if you're working with even a semi-competent teacher, they should be able to diagnose this problem and give you some guidance to help you through it, and to kind of encourage you to, not quit your job, not break up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, not, run out into the desert and, eat rattlesnakes. Because really the main antidote to this issue, the best thing that you can do, is to just simply persevere and just simply keep it the practice. In fact, I would say that the single best predictor of success on any spiritual path that I'm personally familiar with, the best predictor of success that I've seen, is almost a kind of dumb, stubborn insistence on following directions. You really ought to just follow directions. It really is just wash, rinse, repeat. You keep doing the same thing over and over again, and you just have to kind of cultivate an indifference with regard to result. And you just have to keep at it. And, of course, your teacher might give you suggestions on how you might modify your practice to make your time easier. They can probably see, extra causes of suffering that you aren't seeing, ways that you're contributing to the practice that are making it more difficult than it has to be. But for the most part, the biggest predictor of success is almost something like stupidity, that you really don't think about it that much at all, and you just do the damn thing, and you just keep going at it. Because in order to get to the real spiritual fruit is not that initial opening. It's not the Kundalini-like effects. It's not the sparks. It's not the, it's not the sense that you're enlightened or the sense of God. It's not. It actually isn't that. That's a kind of, That's a really sort of minor, immature stage of spiritual development. And I don't say that to denigrate it. I just say that to put it in its proper context. It's a necessary and good thing for a person to go through a stage where they're like, yeah, damn, I'm really enlightened. This is really awesome. And, it actually produces a good amount of enthusiasm and a good amount of energy. And you have to go through that stage to get to this Negredo stage or this dark night stage. But the real spiritual fruits come when you pass all the way through the midnight sun stage. That's when you get to the really deep, far more subtle kinds of insights into aspects of fundamental existence. And you realize that it's not so much about ego aggrandizement, but that there's actually a much wider context going on that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with you as an individual. Now we come to the path of Tsadi and the Emperor. This card and this path involve the He-Tsadi switch. This switch is based upon a passage from the Book of the Law, which says, "All these old letters of my book are aright, but Tsadi is not the star. This also is secret. My prophet shall reveal it to the wise." Crowley ultimately interpreted this passage to mean that the star was attributed to the letter and path of He, and the Emperor was Tsadi. This switch is somewhat more complex than it appears on the surface. So the letters attributed to the cards are switched, but the Roman numerals on those cards are not. You cannot see the Roman numerals on these particular pictures, but the Roman numeral attributed to the Emperor is 4, and the Roman numeral attributed to the star is 17, and those numbers remain. So when I said much earlier that the numbers at the tops of the cards indicated whether you were going in the direction of creation or in the direction of initiation, it's not 100% true, because that interpretation has a wrinkle once you get to this particular card. Also, the Emperor does not take the colors of the path of Tsadi in this deck, but instead retains the colors of He. So you can see here that the king scale color of the path of Tsadi is a purple-violet color, whereas the colors in the Emperor card are the fiery colors of red and red-orange, which are attributed to Aries in the path of He. We can also see that the Emperor card retains the significance of Aries. You can see the rams depicted in here. The star retains the symbolism of Aquarius, or the water bearer. So the change really just seems to hinge on the letters themselves, and in particular the meanings of their letters. Also, interestingly, this doctrine has to do with, or this switch has to do with a core doctrine in Thelema, namely the doctrine of the star. For, as it says in the Book of the Law, every man and every woman is a star. In his book, Initiation in the Aeon of the Child, Dan Gunther gives an interpretation of the significance of this switch. I'm going to briefly recap his argument here. There are a number of reasons. One of them is just that I don't particularly have any insight of my own into this switch. I don't really believe that I could add anything of use on top of what Gunther presents. Another reason is that it's an interesting argument, and oftentimes I see this argument discussed online in various forums, and it seems rather obvious to me from the way people talk about Gunther's position that they actually haven't read the argument. They don't really know what it says. So it's actually pretty useful, I think, just to know what it is. So I'm going to just kind of go through a very quick summary of the argument. There's a lot of details and twists and turns to it, but I'm just going to try to capture the main aspects of it. So Gunther's argument hinges on Atu 17 representing a Thelemic notion of the Messiah. And Gunther's view is that the symbolism of Tsadi is inappropriate to the notion of a Thelemic Messiah. The letter He is appropriate to it. And so that's the reason why the star card had to be moved up to He. So the letter Tsadi, which is attributed to this path, it means fishhook. And so what we're seeing here, what's involved in this path is all of the symbolism pertaining to Jesus as a fisher of men, how Jesus' followers were considered to be fishes, how early baptisms took place in fish ponds. And due to the precession of the equinoxes, Jesus is associated with the transition from the age of Aries to the age of Pisces. So this helps to make sense of why Crowley would attribute the Emperor or the Ram to the path of Tsadi. So you have the age of Aries butting up against the age of Pisces. No pun intended. So let's turn to the notion of the Thelemic concept of a Messiah. Like, is it even appropriate to think about the Messiah in the context of Thelema? Well, the notion of a Christian Messiah we know as a redeemer. The Christian Messiah has to do with the idea of vicarious atonement. So the idea is that Jesus died for our sins, and so for that reason, our sins can be forgiven by placing our trust or our faith in Him. So this sort of raises the question of, is there even a notion of redemption in Thelema, since the idea of Messiah seems to be closely related to redemption? And it might seem on the face of it like there is not, but if you look more closely into the doctrines of Thelema, there is certainly a notion of redemption at work there. For example, if you look at Liber Bet Vel Magi, the Magus redeems with the coin. The coin, or the disc, is associated with Asaya and with Malkuth. We saw that earlier when we were looking at the four worlds on the Tree of Life and the Tarot suits, and how they relate to the four worlds. Malkuth, as we saw earlier, is the virgin, He final, who is placed on the throne of the mother at Binah. And we saw this as a figurative way of describing the entire process of initiation as a whole in the context of Thelema. And so, really, the notion of redemption in Thelema has to do with that particular aspect of the Tetragrammaton formula, which we've been looking at in part this entire time. One of the main differences between the Thelemic notion and the Christian notion is that the candidate for initiation, the aspirant, really carries out this redemption by means of their own power and their own force. There are various forms of help, spiritual and temporal, that the candidate can receive, but it is really the candidate themselves who is doing this by coming into contact with their divine nature, the nature which is inside of them. This is really the general meaning of resurrection that we've been looking at this entire time, that we were examining in the previous cards. And so rather than this being a kind of redemption coming from the outside, right, we were looking at that idea of Pentagrammton, where you have sheen from the outside coming down to redeem matter. That's not really the model that we're looking at in the context of Thelema. In the context of Thelema, redemption is more about awakening to reality as it is. It's really a function of the candidate and of their consciousness and what they can do with their consciousness. And the way for the candidate to do this is laid out in many of the holy books. In particular, with regard to what we're looking at here, especially in book 65, Liber 65. One of the characters that features prominently in that book goes by the name of VVVVV, who is one of the personages that's also mentioned in Liber 10 as being a messenger from beyond who is showing people the way to initiation. We're not talking very much here about the doctrine of crossing the abyss, but one of the ways Crowley talks about VVVVV is as the footprints of a camel in the desert. And so the desert here is the abyss between the real and the ideal. And the footprints through the desert are made by this spiritual entity, VVVVV, showing us the path across it. So the idea here is that a trail is being blazed for each of us to follow. And we are given inspiration to do this by this personage, VVVV, in the holy books. And so for that reason, the Thelemic Messiah is associated with the path He, which is one of the paths that crosses the abyss. Interestingly, one of the things that Gunther does with this switch is that you'll notice that for each of the 3 grades we looked at before, there was an unveiling particular to each of them. One of those unveilings was the unveiling of love. And if you look at the angel and the abyss, the chapter that Gunther writes on the angel is called the unveiling of love. And that was the unveiling that was particular to the path of Tzadi. So what he is implying is that not only does the card, the star, move up to the path of He, but the unveiling associated with the path of Tzadi actually belongs to the path of He. So it's not the unveiling of life, which belongs to He, it is the unveiling of love. So, and that would be associated with full consciousness, or full consciousness of the holy guardian angel, of the nature of the holy guardian angel. We now come to the path of Pe, which means mouth. And indeed, we see depicted in this card a large gaping mouth of a beast and fire coming out of it and destroying a tower. This is probably based on a passage from the book of Revelation, which says, "And the beast opened its mouth to blaspheme against God and slander his name and his tabernacle, those who dwell in heaven." And here we see the destruction of the house of God, which is mentioned in Liber Elve Legis 157. That passage says, "Invoke me under my stars, love is the law, love under will. Nor let the fools mistake love, for there are love and love. There is the dove and there is the serpent, choose ye well. He, my prophet, hath chosen, knowing the law of the fortress and the great mystery of the house of God." And sure enough, we see depicted in this card in the upper left-hand corner the dove carrying the olive branch. And in the upper right-hand corner, we see the lion serpent. Both of them are depicted in the card. The dove, of course, you're probably aware of, is a symbol of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is one of the more mysterious or enigmatic aspects of the Holy Trinity, or at least it always seemed so to me, growing up Christian. It seems to have a number of different traits associated, such as being associated with the human soul or the human spirit. It's often associated with a prophetic voice, so one who prophesies has been inspired by the Holy Spirit. It's associated with a still, small voice. It is considered to be a speaker of truth. It is called forth by music. It is an enemy of deceit, arrogance, and resentment. It is associated with the water of life. It burns without consuming fuel. And it sometimes manifests as a blinding light. And so one of the things I noticed about this is that there seems to be a lot of overlap between the traditional Christian idea of the Holy Spirit, but also the action of the holy guardian angel on the candidate or on the aspirant. The question is, why would the dove or the Holy Spirit be paired with the serpent? Well, we've seen already that the holy guardian angel is identified many times with the serpent, and its action is often described like that of a poison or acid. And there are numerous passages from Book 65 where this association is made. Here are just a few of them. "Thou hast fastened the fangs of eternity in my soul, and the poison of the infinite hath consumed me utterly. Arise, O serpent Apep, thou art Adonai, the beloved one. Thou art my darling and my lord, and thy poison is sweeter than the kisses of Isis, the mother of the gods. As an acid eats into steel, as a cancer that utterly corrupts the body, so am I unto the spirit of man. I shall not rest until I have dissolved it all. So we have here something like the notion of a thing which simultaneously saves, or which is a medicine, but that which is also a poison, or something which corrupts. This is really what's captured in the Greek word pharmakon. Pharmakon means something which is both a medicine and a poison. This notion of the duality or the unity of medicine-poison was essential both to alchemy and also to modern medicine. It was Paracelsus who said, the dose makes the poison. So, for example, at a certain dose, acetaminophen will help your headache or bring down inflammation or fever. At the wrong dose, it will destroy your liver and kill you. In this way, we might contemplate that this card, which seemingly depicts only destruction, might also covertly depict some form of salvation or redemption. We saw earlier that the theme of the function of the outer order, the function of the neophyte grade, was destruction, and also speech in silence. This notion of speech in silence is very important in terms of the getting at the phenomenology of the angel experience. So often when we think about the angel or the idea of the holy guardian angel, we have this notion of, well, roughly something that was depicted on the old judgment card. An angel descending from heaven and, blasting a big trumpet and, the dead rising up out of their graves. Or we really do picture something sort of epic and spectacular, some tableau out of the book of Revelation. But what we find from reading the holy books is something which is far more subtle, something which works on an individual at a much subtler level and without any kind of overt gestures such as, a booming trumpet or even a breaking light. Speech is a function of the mouth, and the mouth, or pe, is attributed to this card. The mouth also contains fangs, and with them, poison. The initiator in the outer order, which is what we're looking at here, is Hor Apep. Apep is the serpent, or deity that embodies chaos. Apep is the greatest enemy of Ra, the sun. But now we see that the greatest enemy of the sun is united with the sun in order to become the initiator of the candidate. But of course, the real initiator is the holy guardian angel, which means that it is the holy guardian angel which at this level is manifesting as a kind of poison or a kind of internal chaos to the candidate. So what does that actually mean? We read in Book 65, Wolf's bane is not so sharp as steel, yet it pierceth the body more subtly. Even as evil kisses corrupt the blood, so do my words devour the spirit of man. So what we've been looking at as this phenomenon of the vision of the holy guardian angel is really neither a vision nor of an angel exactly. At least not in the sense that we might be inclined to think about it. It's not as though the wall of the temple falls away and a great winged creature comes in with a sword in its mouth and light all around it. That sort of visionary magic is more appropriate to what we might call the Yetziratic realm. If you remember back to the Four Worlds, the Yetziratic realm was the realm of spirits of the planets and the stars and the zodiacal signs. And I mentioned that it was sort of the bread and butter magical arena. So as a magician, your basic practice is going to be something like visionary path working. So for example, if you're dealing with, let's say you're dealing with the realm of Ayin, or the path of Ayin, which is what we're looking at here, you would look up in 777 what the color of the path was, and perhaps get an altar cloth for that the color of that path, the appropriate incense. You would do the appropriate prayers to the appropriate gods that are associated with this. This path belongs to Capricorn, so you would perhaps do a Capricorn working, And you would chant the name of the angel, let's say, or the spirit that's associated with the path, and you would scry into the path. And you would have probably, a vision at that point. If you're successful, you would see some, tableau that was appropriate to the path. You might encounter a spirit that gave you a message, and that would, perhaps enrich you in some way or confuse you, as the case may be. This is what I would call sort of bread and butter path working or bread and butter visionary magic, stuff that's really appropriate to the Esoteric realm. The angel experience isn't quite like this. It's not as though there's a path particular to the holy guardian angel that you scry into, and then your holy guardian angel is just kind of hanging out there waiting to give you a message. The process unfolding here is something that's much subtler. It's likened unto wolfsbane, which is a poison, which is working subtly in the blood. The action of the angel on the aspirant is likened unto a kiss. So we're really thinking here of something that is much more subtle than even the kind of Yetziratic workings that we're used to doing when we're scrying into a path. One of the ways to think about what's happening here is as a gradual reorientation of the aspirant, of their soul, away from mundane things, away from profane things, toward the divine. This is one way of looking at it. The concept of the nefesh is useful here. The nefesh is appropriate to this area on the Tree of Life. The nefesh is sometimes called the animal soul, to distinguish it from higher aspects of the soul. So it's considered to be the part of the soul that's closest to the body and to the autonomic processes. And there's nothing wrong with that. A simpler way to think of it might just be the sentience of the aspirant. So sentience is something that we think of as being part of basically, anything that's aware. So anything, from humans down to, let's say, salamanders or possibly even worms. So really what we're talking about here is a reorientation of that basic sort of input-output process, that basic system of meanings that kind of guides us as embodied beings away from the world of the mundane and directing it toward the divine. You can think of, there are many representations of the divine. We see depicted in this card one particular one, the phallus. So the idea of the phallus is, roughly cognate with the idea of the axis mundi, the world tree, which is mentioned in Liber 15, the Gnostic Mass, the sun. But really what we're thinking about here is the point of orientation for a life. So you can think about many different points of orientation that we have in our lives, many different things that we can aim toward. And a person's purpose or their meaning in life is largely defined by what aim they are pursuing, consciously or unconsciously. So each person has their aim, and then you might think about what is the aim of an organization, or what is the aim of, let's say, a country or a nation. You can think of, even if you want, what the aim of the cosmos is. And so this notion of the phallus is supposed to be the idea of the aim of existence itself, the force that is utilizing matter in order to express itself. So the devil is associated with the inverted pentagram. And so if you see certain versions of the devil card, which this is one, you will see the inverted pentagram. And the idea of the inverted pentagram is that it is spirit submerged in matter. And so this symbol has a reputation among certain occult circles as privileging matter over the spirit, and a rejection of spirit in favor of carnal pleasures. As Crowley often does with symbols, he inverts the meaning of this. In the idea of the devil, Crowley sees more the idea of spirit descending into matter in order to utilize matter to express its own ends. And the process that he typically has in mind here is the process of biological reproduction, or what he calls gross reproduction, as opposed to spiritual reproduction. Spiritual reproduction applies more to the path of Zayin and the Lover's card, whereas he associates gross reproduction or biological reproduction with the path of Ayin and the Devil card. This is a process which is celebrated in Liber 15, the Gnostic Mass. So you notice that the Gnostic Mass has the number Liber 15. The Devil card, you can't see it on this depiction, but its Roman numeral is 15 as well. So there is definitely a connection between the devil in a certain sense, in the Thelemic sense, and what is being celebrated in the Gnostic Mass. Namely, this force which is manifesting itself in and through nature using biological reproduction as its particular mode of expression. Now, what does this have to do with the aspirant becoming more attuned to the angel? Well, the means by which the angel is manifesting to the candidate is at this basic level of the animal soul. So it's something that's happening on a very subtle, pre-conscious level. It's not something that's breaking forth in, vision and choirs of angels and things of that. It's really a subtle reorientation at the level of motivation and at the level of the hierarchy of meaning. So the idea of the phallus or the pillar itself is something like the establishment of a hierarchy of meaning. The pillar establishes where the center is, where everyone comes and gathers around and places their gaze and places their adoration. It is a symbol of that center or that pinnacle toward which we strive. And so that is essentially what is happening, except at a very subtle level at this point in terms of the spiritual development of the initiatory candidate. So now we come to the path of Samekh and the art card. As we saw much earlier when I showed the diagram of the three orders, the path of Samekh signifies the entire body of work of the outer college, or what I have been referring to as the grade of neophyte. Samekh corresponds with Sagittarius, or the archer. So in a sense, what we are looking at here is the very concept of aiming. And in particular, we are aiming up, aspiring to the divine. And you can see this in many respects, both in the art on the card, so you can see the arrow emerging out of the cauldron and shooting upward into the heart of the dual-faced being here. So the heart is Tefereth. And so if you look over at the Tree of Life, you can see that the path of Samekh is connecting Yesod, which is the foundation, and it is aiming upward into Tefereth, which is where the grade of Adeptus Minor is achieved, and also where knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel occurs. So both the path and the card itself are visual metaphors of this aspiration upward to the divine. And we read in Liber 7, I shoot up vertically like an arrow and become that above. So we can see it now expressed in verse, this notion of aiming up to meet the divine. Aiming up is something which is important to every life. It's not just something that occurs for the first time in Thelema. In large part, our lives are going to be successful to the extent that we actually aspire to something. Sometimes we can get caught in believing that the best solution into life is to have very few expectations because life is very difficult and many plans do not come to fruition, and one could be easily duped into a form of cynicism over this. But in fact, really what tends to make our lives worthwhile What tends to make all of the difficulty and even all of the suffering meaningful is that we are aiming for something high. We do have high ideals. And having high ideals implies that you are going to run into more obstacles, not less. And so that's the paradox, is that our ability to, let's say, weather challenges or to weather difficulties or to deal with the hardships of life is paradoxically related to our willingness to take on more of them, and to take on more of them in the service of something which is higher, something which is not simply identical with ourselves, but something which transcends our egos. All organizations have to follow this principle as well. For example, in OTO, we have an aim, a pillar around which the community is organized. In terms of USGL, we have a statement of values and a program that we follow. But in terms of a spiritual path, we also have a spiritual aim that we pursue. And that spiritual aim is embodied in the Gnostic Mass. As we saw when we were looking at the Devil card, that spiritual aim is symbolized variously by the world tree, by the phallus, and you could think of all of this as metaphors for the operation of logos in nature, which we were looking at much earlier. That structuring, underlying principle which orders and gives meaning to nature. It's the reason why when we look out into nature, things seem orderly. It's why we can look at a clear causal path leading from the past up until our own existence by means of physics and chemistry and biological reproduction, ultimately. And one can think of their true will as being part of that, as being an instantiation of that principle. You can think of your true will as being the way that logos manifests in the context of a particular nervous system. Part of what OTO is grounded in, part of our own purpose or our spiritual center, is the establishment of an ideal Thelemic society. A society in which everyone is doing their true will, everyone is living their true purpose and realizing their full potential, and that paradoxically, rather than pulling us apart in all different directions, it's actually resulting us creating a larger structure, which is capable of doing more and achieving more than any of us could do on our own. And you can think of the degrees of OTO, in particular the Man of Earth degrees, as providing an ethical foundation for that. There's a kind of personal ethical training that goes on in each of these degrees. And so, for example, you could think of the Minerval degree as introducing the very idea of individual aim as such. You can think of the first degree as having to do with being able to have a steady hand in order to aim. You could think of the second degree as the ability to take aim and fire when you are in motion, when you are in life. You can think of the ways in which that code or that code of conduct can withstand the process of change or death as being embodied in the third degree. And finally, you can consider the cosmological whole into all of which this fits as being embodied in the fourth degree and PI. And of course, by saying this, I'm not really giving anything away of the drama of those degrees. One could very easily not even take notice of these lessons in those degrees, but I do believe they definitely do achieve that aim and can be viewed at that way. And so the issue of personal aim involves consciousness of all these other social, ethical, and even cosmological ideas. In other words, aim does not occur in a vacuum. You need all sorts of supports. You have to assume all sorts of other things in order to do it. As soon as you begin to aim in life, you have to concern yourself with all the things that would help you aim or that would hinder it. And those things are bodily, emotional, social, and in some senses even political or cosmological. The Greek word for sin is amartia, which is actually an archery term, which means missing the mark. And so you might think of the passage from Romans 3:23 where St. Paul says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God." So you can imagine here taking aim and the arrow just falls short of its mark. If you consider the three paths on the tree of life below this, you have Kof, Shin, and Tau. They form the word Kesheth, which means a bow. So if you look at the diagram here of the tree of life, you can see how the path of Samek almost looks like an arrow, which is in a bow, which is being pulled back and down to Malkuth. In the alchemical process, the rainbow appears at the end of the Nigredo phase. So we've been looking at the Nigredo phase this whole time. The Nigredo phase is the work of the neophyte, which we've been looking at those paths this whole time. And Samek is really, technically speaking, the last path before you pass out of neophyte. Because once you get over to the path of noon, which we're going to look at next, that's actually part of the second grade of Adeptus. So once you have traversed and mastered the path of noon, you are actually passing over at that point into knowledge and conversation of a holy guardian angel. Another consideration to think about when looking at this card is the rainbow in it. The rainbow is a beautiful object. And interestingly, in Genesis, the rainbow is associated with the promise of God to never wipe out humanity again with a flood. And I think the reason that the rainbow would be a symbol of promise is probably because the rainbow is beautiful. And when we see things that are beautiful, particularly things in nature that are beautiful, they excite within us the idea of reconciling what is with what ought to be. And if you listen to my talk on art and magic, I really make quite a big deal out of this about beauty being the image of us doing our true will, or being the image of performing the great work. This card also has particular relevance to the Gnostic Mass. So you see here the depiction of the lion and the eagle. If you look at the Lover's card, their colors are reversed. So the eagle is white and the lion is red. And so in Rosicrucian texts or alchemical processes, they talk about the blood of the lion and the tears or the gluten of the eagle and how they swap their essences. And so if you think about what we were talking about before with the formula of Tetragrammaton and the sacred marriage occurring, you can think of the sacred marriage as being a swapping of essences or a uniting of essences. So if you consider that the bread is, or the particle of bread in the Gnostic Mass is the blood of the lion and the wine is the tears or the gluten of the eagle, when you bring those two together, that would be the swapping of the essences. And perhaps you could think of that grail in the Gnostic Mass as being identical with Yesod, which we see depicted here as the cauldron. And then the product of that union would be the arrow flying up out of it, which we could think of as air or spirit. Around the top, outside of the card in the rainbow, it says Visita interiora terre rectificando invenies occultum lapidem, which means visit the interior parts of the earth. By rectification thou shalt find the hidden stone. So this is referring to the production of the Philosopher's Stone, which is a mythical substance capable of transmuting other substances. You could also think of it as something capable of creating any state of affairs out of pure potential or chaos. I would argue that the production of such a Philosopher's Stone is the object of the Gnostic Mass, and is in fact what is produced when the seed particle is depressed into the cup of wine. And it's not an accident at this point that the priest then invokes the lion and the serpent that destroys the destroyer, which relates to Baphomet and the devil, which we saw in the path of Ayin. So here we come to the death card in the path of noon. So the ordeal of the path of noon, or death, technically belongs to the second order, which is Adeptus, which involves knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. I'm going to give a cursory treatment of this path anyway, just for the sake of completeness, so that we've covered all of the paths below Tifereth. So in terms of AA practice, which is the practice that Crowley prescribed to his students, this path corresponds with the practice of Mahasatipatthana, which I think modern people might know better as Vipassana meditation. So Vipassana meditation is the analysis of sensations on a moment-by-moment basis. So basically, the way that you practice this is that you choose an object, and it doesn't really matter so much what the object is, although the common one is the sensation of the breath moving in and out naturally through the lungs. And what you're doing is you're observing the breath, but you're watching how the breath changes on a moment-to-moment basis. And when I say moment-to-moment basis, really what I mean is a very rapid basis. You're kind of ramping the consciousness up so that you can observe really minute changes happening at just a bare sensory level with the breath. I mean, we tend to think of the breath as a single thing, or maybe as something broken up into an inhalation and then an exhalation. But if you pay attention to it, like really close attention to it, you notice that there are actually many parts to it, that the beginning of the inhalation is different from the middle of the inhalation, and different from the end of the inhalation, and that there's this little space in between, and then you start to exhale, and so forth. And you really do sort of get into the minutia of the sensations involved in the breath when you do this. And eventually you become conscious of how other sensations are changing as well. So for example, you might notice the intrusion of various thought processes. And so you start to notice how thoughts will have a beginning and a middle and an end. And you might notice also that consciousness itself sort of has a beginning and a middle and an end, that consciousness itself is not a static object. And so really what you're doing here is you are gradually observing that all of these phenomena are impermanent. And if you realize that they're impermanent, you realize that you don't actually have any control over them. And so you gradually become disillusioned with them. And so it leads to a gradual process of relinquishment of these things. And the sense of identity really does gradually begin to break down. And the culmination of this process is what is called stream entry, or what is the sort of first breakthrough into awareness of Nibbana. So the idea here is that the consciousness gradually becomes disillusioned with all of these impermanent things, and it starts to seek for something which is actually permanent, which it can rest in. And that's when it finds Nibbana. And it will then unbind and go into Nibbana instead. And this process is very similar to the one that I was describing a moment ago about the reorientation of the nefesh away from mundane things toward the divine. A lot of Crowley's terminology that he uses is a sort of, you can think of it as kind of like a Rosicrucian version of Theravada Buddhism. There's in some ways a pretty coherent translation there from one set of concepts to the other. But the way that all of this relates to this path is that when you are going through this process of Vipassana and you're analyzing the sensations, and you're analyzing the sensations that allegedly make up self, you are in a sense murdering yourself. You're dismembering yourself. You're analyzing it, breaking it apart into pieces, and with the purpose of going through a kind of spiritual death, which is sort of what the passage into Nibbana is like. It is it's a moment of annihilation, or it's a moment of cessation. The technical term is cessation of fabrications. And once that happens, you have passed into Nibbana. So it is a kind of spiritual death. And then on the other side of that experience, you reassemble, now with a different view of yourself. When we were looking at the path of Ayin a moment ago, which was the devil card, we were really looking at the path of life itself. This is spirit moving down into matter and using fecundity, using generation, using birth as a vehicle of expression. And now we're looking at the mirror path, which is it's on the other side of Samic, and it has to do with death. So we're dealing here with dual complementary paths of life and death. Ayin is represented by an O in English, Nun by an N. Together they spell the word On, O-N, which is a formula that's mentioned in the Gnostic Mass. So the priest throws his arms across the altar and he says, "Let this offering be borne upon the waves of aether to our Lord and Father the Sun, who traveleth over the heavens in his name On." And so you see that these are two paths also going into the sun. This word is very important in the context of OTO. And at least for the purposes of this talk, you can think of those two letters or that singular formula as representing mastery over life and of death. So if being master of life means taking up the process of change in a way which is expressive and creative, the path of Nun is really about taking up the process of change in a way which is destructive. So all of us accumulate things in our lives that we don't necessarily need, things that aren't expressive of our true will, things that we're hanging on to, old habits that really don't serve our path forward and which hold us back. Relationships that we just choose not to examine, things in ourselves that we're just not looking at, and we hang on to these things at our own peril. Because eventually when you carry around that much extra debris and detritus, you are going to reach some kind of crisis point in your life. And so the process of death is really about examining those things which don't serve the self and essentially cutting them off, dismembering them from oneself and letting go of them. I mean, that's really what the process of learning is all about. There's no way, when you learn, you pass from a state of ignorance into a state of knowledge. So you're giving up one state in order to enter into another. So really the path of death here, what it means to, you could think of taking up death either voluntarily or involuntarily. Involuntary death is when your bad judgment catches up with you in such a way that your life is suddenly burning to the ground. That's involuntary death. That's the kind of death you don't want. That's death which is going to be forced upon you because you've been ignorant and you've really been stupid and you haven't been examining your life. You're just not leading an examined life. And this becomes a big problem for some people around midlife when they look around and they don't have anything to show for themselves. And then suddenly they have to undergo this process of death for the first time. And, who knows what's going to come out on the other side, because it's not done in a willful way. It's not done in a conscious way. The alternative would be to take death upon ourselves voluntarily, to be the self-slain Ankaf Nakansu. This means to go through your life, how frequently is up to you, but it should be done fairly often, to really examine those things that are going on, those habits, and ask, does this really serve me? Is this really aiming towards something? Or is this just causing me to drift around in a circle or in a rut that I'm in for no other reason than that it just feels comfortable and allows me to not have to look at things that are ugly? So what we want to do instead is we want to die voluntarily so that we can enter into a unique position to live fully and to realize our potential, to get rid of these things surrounding us that are clouding us, that are clouding that inner light, the light of that lamp that I was talking about earlier. Knowing God directly is just the most extreme example of this general attitude, but the lesser versions are also deeply spiritual and have religious significance as well. You living a full, meaningful life and realizing your full potential, your humanity, it does have religious significance. It has it in many ways. The potential that you have been given is, in a certain sense, a mystery. You don't know where it came from. You can think of it as being divine. When you think about the good that you can do for yourself simply by living consciously, simply by living in a way that's aware and willing to do things that are difficult and having the courage to do that, there's really no telling how good or how profound your own life can be just on the basis of doing that. You have no idea what the limit would be to that, and the impact that it has on the people who are immediately around you. You could be benefiting them as well in ways that you can't even begin to calculate or begin to fathom. It might cause them to live their lives differently, to live with more meaning and purpose seeing you do it. And that could affect the people around them and help them as well. To say nothing of their children and their children's children. One should never underestimate the importance of doing this kind of work now on an individual level. Start where you have the power to do it and just keep applying it. The benefit that you could have, not just to yourself, but to future generations, it's incalculable. So before ending, I want to provide you guys just a quick summary of what we've been looking at here. It's a lot of information, so it helps to tie it together. So we've been looking at the grade of neophyte, which I've been referring to as the first stage in the process of returning to the divine source. We began by looking at this divine source as a unity of opposites. It was the traditional Kabbalistic union or identity between Ein and Ein Sof, or between nothing and infinity, or if you like, between being and nothingness. I have tried to convince you that this unity of opposites on the grand scale is really just the spiritual goal of the system of Thelema in general. In other words, Kabbalah is not simply part of Thelema, but you can actually view Thelema as a particular kind of Kabbalah, namely one that stresses non-duality or the identity of opposites. So we've been looking at this first grade of neophyte as the first stage of this return, and we've been looking at this as constituting the aspiration upward to the angel. And by looking at the art on these cards and by discussing the symbolism in them, we've been trying to unpack exactly what that upward aspiration means and what it is that we're aspiring toward. One of the themes that we've been looking at is what I refer to as the reorientation toward the divine. And there are a lot of metaphors that come up for this. Metaphors like resurrection, waking up, fermentation, aiming upward, laying the foundation of the pyramid, preparation for the wedding. Success in this endeavor is marked by what we've been calling dark night of the soul, the negredo phase, if we wanted to put it in alchemical terms, or the kiss of the angel, which corrupts the blood and acts as a poison. And what I've tried to convince you of is that all of these metaphors are really just pointing toward progressive disillusionment with the ability of gross pleasures to bring anything like lasting happiness. And that through the practices of purification, prayer, and concentration, which you learn in the outer order, this results in the nefesh, or the animal soul, naturally revolving toward that spiritual sun which can bring true fulfillment. And that experience is the holy guardian angel experience. This union with the divine, so to speak, requires us to voluntarily take death upon ourselves, which doesn't mean killing ourselves. It means systematically seeing through the illusion that anything that I experience, including my thoughts, including my own consciousness, is I or me or mine, or that it occurs in a self, or that it belongs to a self. So I am understanding this practice and this process roughly in Theravada Buddhist terms, which would have been familiar to Crowley through his own practice. And once this process of false identification has been seen through, it really is only a matter of time before fundamental reality is allowed to break through. So in other words, once this identification is no longer getting in the way of correct perception, then actual reality is perceived. And then what we're calling the vision of the holy guardian angel passes over into knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel proper. And that brings us into the second grade, which is Adeptus. So hopefully this talk has been helpful for you. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I will do the best that I can to answer them. May your minds be open unto the light. May your hearts be centers of love. May your bodies be temples of life. Love is the law. Love under will.